I've always loved the solitude of hunting. There's something about the way the woods close in around you. The hush that settles over the land as the sun rises that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. That morning I was with my friend Mike, just the two of us. Miles from the nearest paved road, deep in the heart of the state forest. We set out before dawn, the sky still a deep navy, our breath fogging in the cold. Mike was in high spirits, cracking jokes as we hiked toward the old logging trail we'd scouted the week before. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how the only sounds were our boots crunching leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. We split up at the fork. Mike headed north, and I went west, planning to meet up at the creek around noon. The woods were thick, the ground soft from last night's rain. I found a good spot overlooking a clearing and settled in, rifle across my lap, waiting for the world to wake up. Time passed in a slow, golden trickle. Squirrels darted through the underbrush, a pair of deer ghosted through the trees, but nothing worth taking a shot at. Around 10, I heard something, a branch snapping, heavy footsteps. I tensed, thinking maybe a buck was coming my way. Instead, a man stepped into the clearing. He was tall, gaunt, with a wild beard, and eyes that flicked around like a trapped animal's. He wore a filthy jacket and carried a battered backpack. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, he froze. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us moving. "Morning," I called, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, just stared, his hands buried in his pockets. "You lost?" I asked. He shook his head, barely perceptible, and started to back away. Something about him set my nerves on edge. I watched as he melted back into the trees, moving fast but silent. I waited until he was gone, then radioed Mike. "Hey, you see anybody out here?" I asked. "Nope." "Why?" Mike replied. I told him about the man, and we agreed to meet up early. As I walked back toward our rendezvous, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. When I reached the creek, Mike was already there, looking pale. "I saw him too," he said. He was watching me from behind a tree. Didn't say a word. We debated what to do. It wasn't illegal to be in the woods, but something about the guy felt wrong. And we decided to head back to the truck and call it a day. The walk back was tense. We kept glancing over our shoulders, the woods suddenly feeling claustrophobic. At one point, we heard footsteps behind us, heavy, deliberate. We stopped listening, but the sound vanished. When we reached the truck, we found fresh footprints in the mud too big to be either of ours, leading away from the road.
Ow.
We loaded our gear in silence, nerves frayed. As we drove out, a sheriff's cruiser blocked the road. The deputy flagged us down. "You boys see anyone out here?" he asked. I told him about the man. The deputy's face tightened. "We're looking for someone. Dangerous. If you see him again, don't approach. Just call us." He handed us a flyer. The picture was grainy, but it was him, the man from the woods. The flyer said he was wanted for murder in 2 states. Mike swore under his breath. My hand shook as I gripped the steering wheel. We spent the next hour giving statements, describing everything we'd seen. The deputies fanned out into the woods, radios crackling. Mike and I sat in the truck, watching the trees. Every so often I thought I saw movement, a flash of a jacket, the glint of an eye. The woods, once a place of peace, now felt hostile. Eventually the radio crackled with excitement. It found him, holed up in an abandoned hunting shack less than a mile from where we'd seen him. It surrendered without a fight, but the deputies said he'd been armed. The drive home was silent. Mike finally broke it. "We could have been killed," he said. I nodded, replaying the encounter over and over. The man's eyes, the way he moved, the sense of danger that clung to him like a shadow. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window, made me jump. I kept seeing his face, kept thinking about how close we'd come. In the weeks that followed, I stopped hunting alone. The woods never felt the same. The peace was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. Sometimes I'd catch myself scanning the trees, looking for movement, listening for footsteps that weren't there. People asked me why I didn't hunt anymore. I just shrugged and say I'd lost the taste for it. But the truth was, Dee learned how thin the line is between safety and danger, how quickly the woods can turn from sanctuary to nightmare. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen him first, if he decided to do more than just watch. if somewhere out there, there are others like him moving through the trees, silent and deadly, waiting for someone to cross their path. I've always thought of my uncle's fishing cabin as a place of comfort. It sat at the edge of a forgotten lake, surrounded by pines so thick they swallowed the sun by mid-afternoon. Every summer since I was a kid, I'd spend a week there, just me, Uncle Ray, and the hush of the woods. But the summer I turned 19, everything changed. It started with a storm, the kind that rattles window panes and makes the world outside seem impossibly far away. Uncle Ray and I were gutting fish in the kitchen, our knives scraping against the old wooden table, when the lights flickered and died, he grumbled, lighting a lantern, and sent me to fetch more candles from the storage closet. That's when I noticed the trapdoor. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint outline in the floorboards, half hidden beneath a threadbare rug. I called Uncle Ray over, stared at it for a long moment, then knelt and ran his hand along the seam. "I never noticed this before," he muttered, though his voice sounded uncertain. We pried it open together. The hinges groaned, releasing a gust of cold, stale air. A narrow wooden ladder led down into darkness. Uncle Ray fetched another lantern, and after a moment's hesitation, started down. I followed, heart pounding. The room below was small, barely bigger than a closet. The walls were concrete, stained with something brownish that might have been rust or something else. In the center stood a table, its surface covered in a reddish-brown residue. There were no windows, no furniture, just the table and a single, ancient light bulb dangling from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of rot and old secrets. Uncle Ray stood frozen, lantern trembling in his hand. "Let's go," he said, voice tight, but I couldn't move. On the table, I saw Scratch's words carved deep into the wood, almost frantic. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. Help me. Let me out. I'm still here. My skin crawled. I reached for Uncle Ray, but he was already climbing the ladder, muttering under his breath. I scrambled after him, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. Didn't talk about it that night. Uncle Ray poured himself a drink and sat staring at the fire, his face drawn. I lay awake, listening to the wind howl against the cabin, replaying what I'd seen, the scratches, the stains, the cold that seemed to cling to my bones. The next morning, I found Uncle Ray outside, staring at the lake. He looked older than I had ever seen him. "Some things are better left alone," he said, not meeting my eyes. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his voice stopped me. The rest of the week passed in a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I heard noises, soft thumps from beneath the floor, a faint whisper that might have been the wind, or something else. Uncle Ray barely spoke, and I stopped sleeping altogether. On our last night, the storm returned. Lightning split the sky and the power flickered out again. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, rising from the floorboards. "Help me!" I froze. The voice was thin, desperate, echoing in the darkness. I pressed my ear to the floor. There it was again, a whisper, then a sob. I ran to Uncle Ray's room, but he was gone. The front door stood open, rain lashing the porch. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, calling his name. I found him at the edge of the woods, staring back at the cabin. "We shouldn't have opened it," he said, voice hollow. "Some doors stay closed for a reason." We left before sunrise, driving in silence through the rain. Uncle Ray never spoke of the hidden room again. The next summer, the cabin was sold to strangers. I never went back. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of that room, the cold concrete, the scratched pleas, the voice rising from the darkness. And I wonder what we unleashed, and whether it ever truly left. I've always found solace in the woods. It's a kind of peace that settles over you out there, a hush that's both ancient and alive. I'd been hunting since I was 16, always alone. I liked the quiet, the sense that the world had shrunk to just me, my rifle, and the slow breath of the forest. That October, the air was sharp with the promise of frost, and the leaves were a riot of red and gold. I remember thinking as I parked my old pickup at the end of the logging road, that it was the perfect day to disappear into the trees. The sun hadn't risen yet. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, locked the truck, and started down the narrow trail. The woods closed in around me, branches arching overhead, the ground soft with last night's rain. I moved quietly, boots barely whispering against the leaf litter, every sense tuned to the waking world. My destination was a stand I'd built near a creek, a place where deer trails crossed and the ground was always churned with tracks. As I walked, I felt it a prickle at the back of my neck, like cold fingers brushing my skin. I told myself it was just the darkness, the way the mind plays tricks when you're alone. But the feeling lingered, growing stronger as I reached my stand. I climbed up, settled in, and waited for the sun to rise, rifle across my lap. The forest brightened by slow degrees, mist curling through the trees. I listened to the birds, the distant crack of a branch, the steady thump of my own heart. I tried to let the unease melt away, but it clung to me, sticky and persistent. That's when I heard them voices, low and urgent, drifting across the creek. I froze, straining to listen. To men, maybe more, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was wrong for hunters. No laughter, no easy banter, just tension. I watched through my scope, searching for movement, but the woods were still. The voices faded, swallowed by the trees. I tried to shake it off, but the unease gnawed at me. I checked my phone for a signal, nothing. Typical. I forced myself to focus on the hunt, but my mind kept drifting back to those voices, the sense of being watched. Hours passed. I saw no deer, only the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush. The woods felt wrong, too quiet, as if the animals sensed something unnatural. Around mid-morning, I decided to head back early. As I climbed down from my stand, I saw a fresh rabbit carcass at the base of the ladder. Its head was missing, the body still steaming in the cold air. There were no tracks, no blood trail, just the rabbit placed deliberately. My skin crawled. I scanned the woods, heart pounding, but saw nothing. I slung my rifle and made for the truck, moving quickly, every shadow a threat. The sense of being watched was overwhelming now, a pressure at my back that made me want to break into a run. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, not wanting to look like prey. Halfway to the road, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. I spun, rifle raised, but the woods were empty. I called out, voice shaking, but only the echo answered. I stood there for a long moment, listening, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or a trick of the wind. But the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I started walking again, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The trees seemed to close in, the path twisting in unfamiliar ways. I stumbled, nearly fell, righted myself, and kept moving. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, fogging in the cold air. When I finally broke through the last line of trees and saw my truck, I nearly sobbed with relief. I got closer, my relief turned to dread. The driver's door was ajar, my stomach dropped. I approached cautiously, rifle ready. The cab was empty, but on the seat was a note, scrawled in dirt. "We see you." I slammed the door, locked it, and sped away. Gravel sprang behind me. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse, two figures standing at the tree line, watching. They didn't move. They just stood there, silent and still, as if they'd been waiting for me all along. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window, set my nerves on edge. I kept replaying the day, searching for meaning in the rabbit, the voices, the note. Over the next week, I tried to convince myself it was a prank, some twisted joke. But the fear lingered. I stopped hunting alone. I avoided the woods, the logging road, the creek. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. Someone had broken into a cabin a few miles from where I'd been, hunting doors smashed, furniture overturned, animal carcasses left on the porch. The sheriff asked if I'd seen anything unusual. I told him about the men, the note, the rabbit. He listened in silence, then told me to be careful. "We've had reports," he said, "of strange things out there. People going missing, campsites abandoned." The weeks passed, but the nightmares didn't. Sometimes I dream I was back in the woods, lost and running, the men always just behind me. their footsteps soft and relentless. In the dream, I never made it back to the truck. I'd wake up gasping, the sheets tangled around me like undergrowth. I started locking my doors at night, something I'd never bothered with before. I bought heavier curtains, kept the lights on after dark. My friends noticed the change in me, the way I jumped at sudden noises, the way I scanned every crowd for unfamiliar faces. I told them I'd had a scare in the woods, left out the details. No one would have believed me anyway. Months went by, the leaves fell, the snow came, and still the fear lingered. Sometimes when I was out running errands, I'd catch a glimpse of someone in a crowd tall, broad-shouldered, with a hood pulled low over his face, and my heart would race. I'd hurry home, lock the door, check the windows. I started carrying a knife, then a pistol. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. But the truth was, I knew the men in the woods were still out there, watching, waiting. I could feel their eyes on me when I walked to my truck in the morning. When I took out the trash at night, I stopped going outside after dark. I stopped answering the door unless I knew who was there. One night, months after that morning in the woods, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. I crept to the window, heart hammering. There at the edge of the yard stood two figures. They didn't move. They just watched. I called the sheriff, but when the deputies arrived, the men were gonna know footprints. No sign they'd ever been there. But I knew they were real. I moved out of state not long after. Sold the truck, left the house, started over somewhere new. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream of the woods, the men's voices drifting through the trees, the rabbit at my feet, the note on my seat. In the dream, I'm always running, always just one step ahead. And I know, deep down, that I'll never really escape them. Some things once seen can't be unseen. Some places once entered never truly let you go. I've always loved the hush of the woods at dawn, the way the mist clings to the ground, the way the world feels paused, waiting for your next step. That fall, I set out alone for a weekend hunt in the old pine forest north of town, a place I'd visited since I was a kid. My friends called it the Lost Woods because the trails twisted and vanished, and even experienced hunters sometimes lost their bearings. But I knew the land, or at least I thought I did. I arrived late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. I parked my truck down a narrow dirt road well off the main highway and hiked in with my gear. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. I found my usual clearing, set up camp, and spent the evening watching the sky fade from gold to indigo, the trees turning to black silhouettes against the stars. The first morning I woke before sunrise, made coffee over a small fire, and set out with my rifle. The woods were silent except for the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. I moved slowly, scanning for deer, letting my mind drift with the rhythm of the hunt. A few hours in, I reached a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees were older here, trunks thick and gnarled, branches tangled overhead. I paused, checked my compass, and realized I'd wandered farther than I meant to. I turned to head back, but that's when I saw them. Two people, young, maybe late teens, stood among the trees about 30 yards away. A boy and a girl, both dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the boy in a faded jacket, the girl in a long skirt and sweater. They stood perfectly still, side by side, staring straight ahead. I called out, "Hey, you folks lost?" My voice sounded too loud in the quiet. They didn't move, didn't even turn their heads. I tried again, waving my hand, but got no reaction. The hair on my arms prickled. Something about the way they stood, so silent, felt wrong. I took a step closer, but the girl's head twitched, just a fraction, and I stopped cold. I backed away, heart pounding, and circled wide around them, keeping my eyes on their motionless forms. When I finally looked back from behind a thick tree, they were gone. I hurried back to camp, nerves jangling. I tried to shake it off. Maybe they were just messing with me, or maybe I'd stumbled onto some weird art project. But the image of them standing there, unmoving, haunted me. That night, I double-checked my camp, made sure my gear was packed tight, and slept with my rifle close. I woke several times to the sound of branches snapping, but when I shone my flashlight into the dark, I saw nothing but trees. The next morning, I decided to cut my hunt short. I packed up and hiked back toward the truck, sticking to the main trail. But as I neared the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. All 4 tires on my truck were flat, punctured with roofing nails. I checked the ground and found a line of footprints leading away from the vehicle bare feet, small and narrow. I called the sheriff from the edge of the highway, but there was nothing to be done. I waited hours for a tow, sitting on the tailgate, shotgun across my lap, eyes scanning the tree line. I never saw the boy or the girl again, but I felt watched the whole time. Like their eyes were on me from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. The weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd wake in the night, sure I heard footsteps outside my window, or see pale faces watching from the woods behind my house. My friends laughed it off. Said I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But I knew what I'd seen. Months passed. I stopped hunting alone, started locking every door and window, even in broad daylight. Sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse in the rearview mirror, a flash of a pale face, a pair of unmoving eyes, gone before I can be sure. I never went back to the lost woods. But I still dream about that day, the boy and the girl, standing silent and still among the trees, waiting for someone to notice them. And I wonder if they're still out there watching, waiting for the next hunter who wanders too far from the path. The woods at night have a kind of silence that's almost alive. I've always loved that the way the darkness presses in, the way every sound feels amplified, important. But that night I learned there's a difference between being alone in the wild and being watched by it. It was late November. The kind of cold that seeps through your boots and into your bones. I'd spent the day tracking a buck through thick underbrush, losing the light faster than I'd planned. By the time I realized how late it was, the sun had vanished behind the trees, and the woods had become a world of shadows and whispers. I clipped my little LED light to my jacket and started the long walk back to my cabin. The beam was weak, barely enough to show the trail, but I knew the way by heart. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, but the scope was useless in the dark. I felt exposed, every step echoing in the hush. Halfway home, I heard the unmistakable yip of a coyote. Then another, closer. I stopped, heart thudding, and swept my light in a slow arc. That's when I saw them. 5 sets of eyes, glowing green in the beam. Low to the ground and unmoving, coyotes maybe 7 or 8 feet away, just watching. I tried to keep my breathing steady. "Get out of here," I yelled, waving my arms and stomping my boots. The eyes didn't flinch. Instead, 2 of the coyotes slunk off to the sides, disappearing into the brush, flanking me. Started walking again, faster now, trying not to run. I knew better than to look like prey. The coyotes followed, their eyes flickering in and out of the shadows. I could hear them now, soft paws on leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. My skin crawled. Every few steps I'd stop and yell, trying to scare them off. It didn't work. They were patient, clever, and hungry. I felt a phantom nip at my ankle and spun, rifle up, but saw nothing. My hands shook. I realized how vulnerable I was. 1 shot, and the rest would be on me before I could reload. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. My little light flickered, threatening to die. In fact, I cursed myself for not carrying a better flashlight or a sidearm. The coyotes kept pace, always just out of reach, their eyes reflecting back at me like tiny lanterns. I started talking to myself, anything to fill the silence. Okay, almost there, just a little farther. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. The yipping started again, louder, closer. It felt like a game to them, and I was losing. Finally, I saw the faint outline of my cabin through the trees. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the coyotes behind me, their excitement building. I broke into a run, boots slipping on wet leaves, breath burning in my chest. The yipping turned to barking, the sound circling the cabin. I got the door open, slammed it behind me, and locked it tight. I leaned against the wood, heart hammering, listening as the coyotes circled outside, their voices rising and falling in the dark. I sat on the floor for a long time, rifle across my lap, listening to them. Eventually the sounds faded, and the woods went quiet again. But the silence felt different. Now charged, watchful. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I kept seeing those eyes in the dark, kept feeling the nip at my ankle. I realized how close I'd come to being just another story whispered by the woods. The next morning, I found paw prints circling the cabin, pressed deep into the mud. I never hunted at night again without a sidearm. I never forgot the lesson the coyotes taught me. In the wild, you're never truly alone. Sometimes something is out there, watching, waiting for you to make a mistake. I've always believed the woods held secrets, but nothing prepared me for what I saw that night on the edge of the old farmland. It was the third evening of my solo hunting trip, and I'd set up camp near a long-abandoned property deep in the hills. The locals called it Hollis Farm, a place with a sagging barn, wild overgrown fields, a farmhouse slowly collapsing into itself. I'd heard stories, strange lights, missing livestock, the usual rural legends, but I'd always chalked it up to small-town gossip. That night, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. I'd just finished cleaning my rifle and was tending a small fire, the flames flickering shadows across the trees. The moon was a thin, pale coin behind a veil of clouds. I remember feeling an odd stillness settle, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard footsteps crunching through the brush. Not the skitter of a raccoon or the cautious tread of a deer. These were heavy, deliberate. My hand went to my flashlight and I called out, "Hello, who's there?" My voice sounded thin in the darkness. From the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. At first I thought it was another hunter tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a slow, dragging gait. But as he stepped into the firelight, my breath caught. He wore tattered overalls, the fabric stained and torn, and a battered hat pulled low over his brow. In one hand, he gripped a long, rusted machete. But it was his face that froze me in place, ashen, almost luminous, with eyes so blue they seemed to glow. His expression was twisted with sorrow and something deeper, something ancient. He stopped on the far side of the fire, staring at me. The flames flickered between us, casting his features in shifting shadow. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry. The air felt colder, and the hairs on my arms stood up. He raised the machete not in threat, but almost in greeting. Then he let out a sound I'll never forget. A long, mournful scream that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was a cry of loss, of anger, of something left unfinished. My legs locked, couldn't move, couldn't look away from those burning blue eyes. The scream faded, swallowed by the trees. The figure turned, moving back into the darkness. I watched, rooted to the spot as he vanished among the shadows, the night swallowing him whole. I sat by the fire until dawn, too shaken to sleep, the echo of that scream ringing in my ears. When morning came, I found footprints in the soft earth bare, wide, and impossibly deep, leading from the woods to my camp and back toward the ruins of the farmhouse. I packed up and left that morning, the weight of the encounter pressing on my chest. I never hunted near Hollis Farm again. If you ever hear me tell this story, it's usually with a laugh and a shake of my head because it's easier to joke than to admit how close I came to never walking out of those woods. But if you want the real version, the one that still wakes me up in a sweat some nights, you'll have to listen close. Because this isn't just a hunting story. It's the night I learned what it means to be prey. It started like any other late September hunt. The forest was thick with mist, the ground soft and cold beneath my boots. I'd been tracking elk since dawn, letting the silence settle over me, letting my mind wander. Out there, you start to believe you know the land, that you're in control. But the woods have a way of reminding you that you're just a visitor, and sometimes you overstay your welcome. By midday, I'd wandered farther than I meant to, following a trail that twisted deeper into a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees pressed in close, the light grew thin, and every sound seemed to echo a little too long. I paused to check my bearings, but my usual landmarks were gone, swallowed by the dense undergrowth and the shifting light. I told myself not to worry. I'd always prided myself on my sense of direction. And besides, I still had hours of daylight left. That's when I heard it, a wet, tearing noise, rhythmic and heavy, coming from just beyond a stand of pines. I froze, heart thumping, and eased forward, every step careful, every sense on edge. Through the brush, I caught a glimpse of something massive, a black bear. Bigger than any I'd ever seen, hunched over a carcass. 2 cubs tumbled nearby, but it was the mother Sizand, the way she tore into that dead cow, that made my blood run cold. I should have backed away. I should have listened to the voice screaming in my head. But I couldn't move. I was caught between awe and terror, watching her like I was seeing something out of a nightmare. Then the wind shifted. She lifted her head and her eyes locked onto mine. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. I could feel the weight of her stare, the ancient warning in it. She rose up, jaws popping, and in that moment, I knew. I was no longer the hunter. She charged. The forest exploded into chaos. I fired a shot into the ground, hoping to scare her, but she kept coming. I turned and ran, branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my clothes, the ground shaking with her every step. I spotted a pine tree tall, with low branches, and scrambled up just as she crashed into the trunk, making the whole tree shudder. She circled below, popping her jaws, swiping at the bark, her cubs whining in the brush. I clung to that branch, heart pounding, sweat freezing on my skin, every muscle cramping with fear. She wouldn't leave. She paced, growled, slammed her weight against the tree. I lost all sense of time. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before she finally lumbered off, her cubs trailing behind. But even after she disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to climb down. I sat in that tree, legs shaking, listening to the forest slowly regain its voice. The birds returned first, tentative and distant. Then the wind picked up, rustling the leaves. I tried to steady my breathing, but every snap of a twig made me flinch. I kept replaying the charge in my mind, the speed, the power, the way she seemed to fill the whole world. Eventually, hunger and exhaustion won out over fear. I slid down the trunk, my hands scraped raw, and forced myself to retrace my steps. The woods felt different now, closer, darker, as if the trees themselves were watching. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a threat. I walked fast, barely daring to look over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment I'd see those eyes again. When I finally broke through the trees and saw my truck, I nearly wept with relief. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, hands shaking on the steering wheel. The sun was setting, painting the sky blood red, and I realized just how close I'd come to being nothing more than another story whispered by the woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Hertho's eyes, that rush of power, the reminder that out there, I'm not at the top of the food chain. I kept the lights on, rifle within arm's reach, listening to the wind rattle the windows. I thought about the stories I'd heard growing up about hunters who vanished, about strange shapes moving through the trees at night. I understood them now, in a way I never had before. The days that followed felt different. I jumped at sudden noises, scanned every crowd for unfamiliar faces, locked every door and window, even in broad daylight. My friends laughed it off, said I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew how it felt to be hunted. So if you ever ask me about the wild and I smile and say it keeps you humble, no, there's more to the story. Out there, you're never as safe as you think. And sometimes the woods decide to remind you just how small you really are. We were deep in Idaho sheep country, 3 friends on a hunt we'd been planning for months. The days were long and exhausting, at the kind of hiking that leaves your legs burning and your mind empty, except for the next ridge, the next glassing spot. That third night, we made camp on a flat patch above the river. Strung a tarp between 2 trees and rolled out our bivy sacks underneath. The air was cold and still, the stars so bright you felt like you could reach up and scatter them with your hand. I remember falling asleep with the sound of the river in my ears, my headlamp and revolver within arm's reach, just in case. The last thing I remember before drifting off was Bobby snoring beside me and the wind rustling the tarp. When it happened, it was so sudden it didn't feel real. I was deep in a dream, something about home, my wife's voice, the smell of coffee when I felt a yank at my scalp, hard and cold and wet. For a split second, I thought I was still dreaming. Then the pain hit, sharp and hot, and I woke to darkness and confusion. Something was pulling me, dragging me by the head. My face was pressed into the nylon of my bivy sack, and I could feel warm blood running down my neck. My arms flailed, and my hand connected with something coarse and heavy, a paw, fur, the unmistakable stink of wild animal. I realized, with a cold clarity, that a bear had my head in its mouth. I don't remember screaming. I remember hitting, clawing, doing anything I could to make it let go. The tarp collapsed over me as Bobby shot awake, cursing and thrashing. The bear let go for a moment, and I rolled onto my back, staring up at a hulking shadow that blocked out the stars. Bobby's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't move." Heard the click of his revolver, saw the flash as he fired point blank into the bear's face. The roar was deafening, and the bear reared back, shaking its head, blood spraying across the tarp. For a second, I thought it would come back for us, but it spun and crashed into the brush, the ground shaking with its weight. We sat there, tangled in the tarp, hearts pounding, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. My head was throbbing, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. Bobby crawled over, his face pale in the beam. "You okay?" he asked, voice trembling. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hair was matted with blood, my scalp burning. I kept expecting the bear to come back, to finish what it started. We listened, holding our breath, as the sounds of the forest slowly returned: crickets, the river, the distant call of an owl. We found the bear a few minutes later, slumped against a tree, blood pooling beneath its head. Bobby had shot it right through the jaw, a lucky shot at that range. We stood over it in silence, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Back at camp, we cleaned my wounds as best we could, using water from our canteens and a first aid kit that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. I could feel every heartbeat in my scalp, but the bleeding slowed, and I realized I was damn lucky to be alive. We didn't sleep much after that. Every sound made us jump. I kept my hand on my revolver, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the tarp, waiting for another shadow to move. Dawn finally came, pale and cold, and we broke camp in silence, packed up, hiked out, and made our way to the nearest ranger station to report the incident. The ranger took one look at my head and shook his own. "You boys are lucky," he said. "Most folks don't walk away from something like that." It wasn't until we were back in town, sitting in a diner with hot coffee and bandaged heads, that it really hit me. The randomness of it. The way one moment you're dreaming of home, and the next, you're fighting for your life in the dark. I've been back in the woods since then, but I sleep lighter now. I keep my weapon closer, my senses sharper, and every time I close my eyes under the stars, I remember the weight of that bear, the heat of its breath, and the thin line that separates the hunter from the hunted. If you ever want to know what true fear feels like, I'll tell you about that night in Idaho, about the blood in my eyes and the sound of Bobby's revolver. I'll tell you how the wild doesn't care about your plans, your experience, or your bravado. Out there, you're just another animal. And sometimes, you're the one who gets dragged from your sleep. That's the story I tell, and the one I'll never forget. I'll never forget the sound the bear made as it forced its way through the window like the world itself was being torn open. I'd been alone in that northern Alberta cabin for 4 days, deep in the spruce and poplar, miles from the nearest road. The trip was supposed to be a reset. Just me, the cold, and the promise of moose sign in the frosty mornings. I'd hunted these woods before, but this time the silence felt heavier. Maybe it was the early snow, the way the wind rattled the eaves, or the knowledge that the nearest neighbor was a good hour's drive away. Whatever it was, I felt watched. The first 2 nights passed in the usual rhythm-long hikes at dawn, careful glassing at dusk, and evenings spent cleaning my rifle by the wood stove. I kept the fire going, the old iron stove popping and hissing as the wind howled outside. The cabin was sturdy, built by trappers decades ago, with thick logs and tiny windows set high in the walls. I'd always felt safe here. On the 3rd night, I woke to a scraping noise, soft at first, then insistent. I sat up in my cot, heart pounding, listening as something heavy circled the cabin. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows through the frosted panes. I reached for my flashlight and revolver, moving slow, careful not to make a sound. The noise stopped. I waited, counting my breaths, the only sound my own heartbeat. Then, with a suddenness that made me flinch, something slammed against the back wall. The whole cabin shuddered. I froze, every muscle tensed. The scraping returned, louder now, claws raking the wood. I could hear the bear's breath deep, ragged, hungry. I crept to the window, peering through the frost. A hulking shadow moved just beyond the glass, its fur matted with snow. The bear reared up, paws pressed against the window frame. For a moment, it stared right at me as black and bottomless, reflecting the firelight. I'd seen bears before, but never like this. There was something wrong in its gaze, something desperate. Before I could react, the bear lunged. The old window frame splintered with a scream of wood and glass. Shards rained across the floor as the bear forced its head and shoulders through the opening, jaws snapping. I stumbled back, tripping over the cot, the revolver shaking in my hand. The bear's head swung side to side, sniffing, grunting, its breath steaming in the cold air. Ow. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling, hoping the noise would drive it back. It barely flinched. Instead, it heaved its bulk farther into the room, claws scrabbling for purchase on the floorboards. I backed toward the stove, the heat at my back, the bear filling the tiny cabin with its presence. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The bear lunged again, jaws snapping inches from my leg, and I fired twice more, the shots deafening in the close space. One bullet grazed its shoulder and it roared, shaking the whole cabin. For a moment, I thought it would retreat. But it only grew angrier, thrashing in the wreckage of the window, foam flecking its lips. I grabbed the fire poker, swinging wildly as it clawed at the stove, scattering embers across the floor. Smoke filled the room, the heat and chaos blurring the edges of everything. Finally, with one last shot, this time aimed between its eyes, the bear slumped, its massive body blocking the broken window. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and my own ragged breathing. I stood there for a long time, revolver shaking in my hand, the smell of blood and burnt wood thick in the air. When I finally stepped outside, dawn was breaking, the snow stained red beneath the window. I radioed for help, my voice barely steady. It took hours for the rangers to arrive. They found me sitting by the stove, staring at the bear's body, the cabin cold and gutted. They said it was a predatory attack rare, but not unheard of. The bear was old, starving, driven mad by hunger in the early winter. I didn't set out that morning, expecting to stare death in the face. In Alaska, you always know it's a possibility, especially when you're miles from the nearest road, deep in bear country. Rifle slung over your shoulder, and the world reduced to breath, boot crunch, and the cold bite of air. But there's a difference between knowing and feeling it in your bones, and that day I learned the difference. The trip had started like so many others. I'd flown in supplies with my old friend Mark, set up camp along a bend in the river where the salmon ran thick and the brush pressed in close. We'd hunted together for years, and we knew the drill. Keep food locked, stay alert, never let your guard down after dusk. But that fall, something felt off. The fish runs were thin, the woods quieter than usual. Even the crows seemed nervous. On the fourth morning, I woke before dawn, the sky just beginning to pale. Mark was still snoring in his tent, so I brewed coffee over the camp stove, savoring the bitter warmth. By 6, I was hiking a priver, rifle ready, eyes scanning for sign. The ground was soft, mossy, and littered with half-eaten salmon carcasses, some fresh. Some picked clean by foxes and gulls. The air was sharp with the smell of rotten cold water. I'd gone maybe 2 miles when I saw the tracks. Huge splayed, claws gouging deep into the mud. I knelt, pressing my palm beside one print. It dwarfed my hand. I'd seen big bears before, but this one was something else. The tracks wandered along the riverbank, weaving between willows, sometimes doubling back on themselves. I followed, heart thumping, every sense on edge. The first sign of trouble was the silence. No birds, no wind, just the distant rush of water and my own breathing. I rounded a bend and froze. There, 50 yards ahead, was the bear. He was massive, easily 9 feet long, his fur patchy and dull. He looked wrong thin, almost skeletal, ribs showing beneath his hide. His head hung low, jaws working as he chewed a clump of grass. That's when I knew. He was starving. Bears don't eat grass unless they're desperate. I raised my rifle not to shoot, but to be ready. The bear lifted his head, black eyes fixing on me. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then he started toward me slow at first, then faster, his gait uneven but determined. I shouted, waving my arms, but he didn't break stride. I fired a warning shot into the dirt. He broke into a run. Everything happened at once. I chambered another round and fired at his chest. He barely flinched. It was on me in seconds, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I fired again, aiming for his shoulder. But he kept coming. I could see his teeth yellow and broken, his breath steaming in the cold air. I backed up, nearly tripping over a root, fumbling for another round. My hands shook. The bear was 5 yards away, then 3. I fired again this time. The shot rang out, and the bear stumbled, blood blooming on his chest. But he didn't stop. He lunged, jaws snapping, and I threw myself sideways, rolling through the mud. He crashed past me, spinning, trying to find me in the brush. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, and fired my last round into his head. He dropped, finally crashing into the willows with a sound like a tree falling. Stood there, shaking, staring at the bear's body. He was enormous, but wasted, his fur matted, his belly sunken. I realized then how close I'd come. If my rifle had jammed, if I'd missed, I'd be nothing but another carcass on the riverbank. I radioed Mark, my voice barely steady, and he came running. We stood over the bear in silence, the weight of what had happened settling over us. Later, when we reported the kill, the biologist told us the bear was old, his teeth worn down, his stomach empty, but for grass. He'd been starving, driven mad by hunger. That night, back at camp, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black eyes, felt the ground shake beneath his charge. The wild had always felt like home to me, but now it felt different, darker, more dangerous.